Welcome to This Explainer, everyone. Today, we are embarking on a truly astonishing historical journey. We're tracing the unbelievable trajectory of the world's largest empire. Now, at its absolute height, this single entity ruled over territories on almost every continent on Earth. It commanded the world's most powerful navy and governed millions of people across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and the Pacific. There was a time when it was said, quite literally, without any exaggeration, that the sun never set on the British Empire.
Okay, let's dive into this, because we're looking at one of the most fascinating puzzles in human history. Seriously, how does a relatively small island nation, positioned just off the coast of Europe, manage to command a globe-spanning, incredibly complex system of territories, resources, and people? And perhaps just as importantly, how did an empire that dominated global politics for generations manage to unravel so incredibly quickly?
To put things into perspective, at its height, the empire covered roughly 25%, a full quarter of the world's land area. That is nearly 14 million square miles, containing hundreds of millions of people living under British rule. It's just massive. But, to understand how this incredible global footprint was achieved, we have to look back to a time before Britain was a dominant force, back to an era when they were just trying to get a foot in the door.
So let's start with Section 1, An Island's Global Reach, the 16th Century Scramble.
You see, the early British Empire was absolutely not some grand, calculated master plan. Actually, in the 16th century, England was essentially a latecomer, just scrambling for a seat at the table. Spain and Portugal, they already had these enormous overseas empires. The Dutch were busy building a massive commercial network, and France was actively expanding its influence. England desperately wanted a place in this new world, and their early tactics were a messy, improvised combination of exploration, trade, outright piracy, and piecemeal colonization across the Atlantic. It was fierce European competition, pure and simple.
That brings us to Section 2, the corporate territorial conquest, the East India Company.
Okay, this involves arguably one of the strangest, most bizarre developments in all of imperial history. Founded in 1600, the East India Company was just a simple trading venture. Its one and only goal was to make money through trade with Asia. But over time, this private business evolved into a sprawling territorial power. Just imagine a modern tech giant or corporation today building its own armies, signing international treaties, collecting taxes from regular citizens, and literally fighting wars. Well, that is exactly what happened here. A private business transformed into a ruling nation-state, eventually commanding a private army twice the size of the regular British military. It's wild to think about.
And the evolution of this company is just staggering. In 1600, they start trading. Fast forward to the 1700s, and they are deeply entrenched in India, utilizing military victories and sheer economic pressure to collect taxes and build armies. But, as you might guess, this massive corporate overreach caused enormous disruption to traditional industries and local land systems. This mounting tension inevitably snapped in 1857, when a major uprising of Indian soldiers within the company's own army erupted. The revolt spread rapidly, leading to brutal repression by British forces. The consequences of this were totally historic. The British government finally stepped in, ended the company's rule entirely, and in 1858, Queen Victoria and the British Crown took direct control. This officially began the era known as the British Raj.
Now, through all of this, the empire was remarkably adaptable. Remember, just a few decades prior to the height of the Raj, Britain faced a massive, humiliating disaster. In 1783, they officially lost their 13 North American colonies after the American Revolution. The loss of wealth and territory was enormous, but the empire didn't collapse. Instead, they strategically pivoted. They redirected their ambitions, making India increasingly central to their plans, establishing Australia as a colony, and expanding their reach deep into the Pacific.
Which leads us to Section 3, Industry and Imperial Peak, the engine of empire.
As we move into the 19th century, British naval dominance, which, by the way, had been firmly secured in 1805 at the famous Battle of Trafalgar, merged with radical new technologies to create a true engine of empire. There was this undeniable synergy at play. Rapidly industrializing factories back home desperately needed raw materials. Well, the colonies provided those materials and in turn became a massive captive market to buy the manufactured British goods. It was a perfect feedback loop. Industrial power strengthened imperial power and vice versa. Britain was no longer just an island. It was the humming center of a global economic network.
But managing a global network of that size required immense flexibility. Empire was never just about planting flags on maps, right? It was about power,
resources, and control. Sometimes they used direct military conquest. Sometimes they used indirect rule, where local rulers actually stayed in place but operated under extremely heavy British influence. And other times, their power was purely commercial, built on strategic alliances with local elites. This flexibility allowed for incredibly rapid expansion across places like Canada, Africa, and the Caribbean. However, we have to note that this system created enormous inequalities. British subjects simply did not have equal political rights everywhere, and economic development was frequently shaped entirely around imperial priorities, not local needs.
Moving right along to Section 4, World Wars and Resistance, the Greatest Challenges.
As we enter the 20th century, we see this fascinating irony. The empire essentially created the very conditions for its own opposition. First, Western-style education introduced concepts like constitutional government and national self-determination, while colonial leaders then used those exact concepts to challenge British rule. And ironically, the very railways and telegraphs the British built to extract wealth suddenly allowed resistance movements to communicate and coordinate across vast territories. The idea spread like wildfire. This transformed urban centers into vital hubs for mass political organization, civil disobedience, and boycotts, tactics famously promoted by leaders like Mahatma Gandhi.
So, while this resistance was steadily growing, Britain was suddenly plunged into two catastrophic global conflicts. During World War I, the empire mobilized millions of troops from India, Canada, Africa, and beyond. Now, this undeniably helped Britain survive, but it severely weakened the imperial system and completely exhausted their finances. Then came World War II. Britain survived Nazi Germany, which was a monumental victory, but the economic toll was absolute. Britain was entirely exhausted. Global dominance rapidly shifted to the United States and the Soviet Union, and maintaining the empire in the way they had before, that was simply no longer a sustainable reality.
The geopolitical shift was huge, but it also came with a terrible human cost. In 1947, British India finally became independent, partitioned into two new nations, India and Pakistan. But that division sparked staggering communal violence. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost as millions of people desperately moved across these newly created borders. The end of British rule in India was undeniably one of the most important moments in the collapse of the empire, but it was deeply grounded in terrible tragedy.
This brings us to Section 5, the Age of Decolonization, the Rapid Collapse.
That pivotal year of 1947 triggered a true domino effect. The age of European empires unraveled at a breathtaking pace. Following India, Ghana gained independence in 1957, then Nigeria in 1960. Piece by piece, across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, colonial territories demanded and won their independence. Some of these transitions were peaceful, others, unfortunately, involved long wars of independence. This massive, sweeping historical shift eventually leads us down the timeline to 1997, when Hong Kong was transferred to China. That moment largely symbolized the end of a colonial era that had lasted for centuries.
Finally, let's look at Section 6, the Modern Imperial Legacy, a Changed World. The empire itself is gone, but we have to neutrally examine the remarkably complicated remnants it left behind. We really can't reduce this history to pure achievement or pure destruction. It was undeniably transformative, building vast global connections, modern infrastructure, and spreading institutions across the globe. But at the exact same time, it was fundamentally unequal. The whole system relied heavily on military coercion, deep economic exploitation, strict racial hierarchies, and forced conquest. It was both of these things at once, and holding both those realities is absolutely crucial to understanding this history.
And you can still see the remnants of this dual legacy literally everywhere today. If you look at your own life, the global financial market centered in London, the tea in your cup, or even the English language we are speaking right now, you are interacting with the ghosts of this empire. Geopolitically speaking, many of the modern borders and political institutions that dictate current relations across South Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East emerged directly from decisions made during this exact period. The empire disappeared for sure, but its consequences certainly did not.
Which leaves us with this final, profound thought to chew on. No empire is permanent. Power can appear completely unstoppable for generations, right? Dominating oceans, reshaping global trade, ruling millions, and then, within just a few decades, it's gone. It really forces us to look at the world map today and ask, which of our current, seemingly invincible global powers will soon exist only as a chapter in our history books? Thanks so much for exploring this history with me.